Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
In the mid-19th century, a feud erupted between two camps of prominent public intellectuals and thought leaders in the United States. The results of this feud affected the education, culture, and lives of generations of Americans. And yet, you've probably never heard of it.
Maybe you have, but we're going to guess that a significant number of you haven't. We're referring to the feud between two camps of educators of deaf Americans. On the one side were the manualists, who believed that deaf people should be educated in manual methods in the form of sign language. On the other side, the oralists, who believed that deaf people should not use sign, but instead be educated in how to read lips and vocalize spoken English.
It might be easy to see this as just a schism between two pedagogical perspectives. Is it better to teach using this method or that method? But this was about much more than educational approaches. Instead, it became about the very place of deaf people in United States society. Thinkers and educators had spent decades of the 19th century debating the nature of deafness and the deaf mind. Could deaf people think and reason without formalized language? Could they tell right from wrong? Or were they animal-like? How might deaf people exist in a civil society if they did not share a common language? Were deaf people a distinct cultural group or disabled individuals who could be and should be assimilated? Today, we're talking about the history of deaf education in the United States. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Avril.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We want to thank all of our Patreon supporters and especially our fabulous auger and excavator level patrons. Lisa, Carl, Karen, Jessica, Maria, Denise, Edward, Lauren, Colin, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you're not yet a patron of this show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
Before we start, I want to be upfront and say that there's actually no way that we can tell a full deaf history of the United States in one episode. So in this episode here, we're going to try to give a very broad introduction to deaf U.S. history before the 19th century, and then really focus in on the debate over deaf education in the mid to late 19th century. It's just in no way the entirety of deaf American history. Of course, right? Like we just can't cover everything in one episode. It also runs the risk, like focusing on this particular slice of deaf history, also runs the risk of overemphasizing some of the more negative or difficult aspects of deaf history at the risk of underemphasizing deaf joy, deaf agency, and thriving deaf cultures. But this reflects only what's possible in one podcast episode, not our judgments of what we think is worth learning or what is worth sharing. And of course, as with every episode, we rely on the hard work of many scholars. For this episode, we relied on the incredible and important work of disability historians Douglas Bainton, R.A.R. Edwards, who I will sometimes refer to as Rebecca Edwards in the text, Kim Nielsen, Susan Birch, and Katie Booth, among many others. And a big thank you to Gallaudet University's very accessible websites on deaf history. They were also really helpful as I put this episode together.
Sign language in the Americas has a history older than the United States. People who were born deaf in most Native American tribes were not understood or treated as distinct from the rest of the community, nor were they likely to experience difficulties communicating with their families and villages. According to historian Kim Nielsen, nearly all Indian language groups had some aspect of signed communication, many of which were shared between tribes or nations. Studies now show that sign language exists or existed in at least 40 different linguistic groups in the Americas. The most common sign language was Plains Indian Sign Language, or PISL. The use of Plains Indian Sign ranged from the Saskatchewan River in the north to the Rio Grande in the south. This language was incredibly useful because it allowed for communication between tribes that spoke linguistically distinct dialects or languages, facilitating trade in this huge area in the heart of North America. The primary use of Plains Indian Sign was to facilitate communication between groups, but it was also, of course, used by deaf Indians, meaning that they never experienced a time when they couldn't communicate with family, friends, and community. Anyone who lost their hearing over time, due to illness or old age, also transitioned to primarily using sign without losing the ability to communicate. They didn't experience isolation or stigma because of their deafness.
Sign language, although a different kind, was also used dating back to sometime around 1700 on the island of Martha's Vineyard on the coast of Massachusetts. Jonathan Lambert, a deaf man, was born a few miles north of Cape Cod in 1657. Later, he moved to Martha's Vineyard along with his 7 children, 2 of whom were also likely deaf. According to historian Nora Ellen Gross, there were several other early settlers of Martha's Vineyard who, like the Lamberts, carried a genetic predisposition for congenital deafness. And as a side note here, Gross actually dug even deeper and found that all of these families came from a Puritan community in the same region of Kent, England, which may also explain why there were several families in this same area that all shared this trait. I don't know how she did this research. It must have been so painstaking. It's incredibly fascinating. Either way, over the ensuing decades, these families that were all living in the same area in Martha's Vineyard produced a few deaf children from generation to generation because of this genetic trait. Because Martha's Vineyard was an island, this led to the creation of a relatively isolated society with a very significant population of deaf people living among hearing people. The result was that virtually the entire population of Martha's Vineyard was bilingual in both English and a form of sign language that came to be known as Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, likely a dialect of a sign language that had been used in the Kent region of England, known as Old Kent Sign Language. So a direct result of that, that genetic trait having come from Kent, right? Most islanders learned sign language as children informally. There were no classes and no formal instruction, but they used it interchangeably with English in their daily lives. As a result of this, not unlike Plains Indian Sign Language, deafness was not understood on Martha's Vineyard as a disability, but rather a simple human difference, like being really tall or having red hair.
Outside of Martha's Vineyard, sign language, if it existed at all in the United States, was ad hoc and typically what most linguists call home sign, a form of improvised sign that often develops within families when a member is deaf. Because there was no formalized language instruction before the early 19th century, there were very few options for deaf children to get an education. Most deaf children stayed home with their families, communicating with home sign or developing their own communication style, which meant that they often could not communicate with people not in their immediate communities. Deaf people were also often isolated, not only because their language options were limited, they were also unlikely to know other deaf people unless they had other deaf family members. Wealthy families did have the option of sending their children to school in Europe. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, most sent their children to Thomas Braidwood's schools in Scotland and England.
Thomas Braidwood was a Scottish tutor who taught writing to the children of the wealthy in his home. In 1760, Braidwood was asked to try teaching the deaf son of a wealthy wine merchant. From this point, Braidwood focused his career on the education of the deaf. He becomes kind of fascinated. Braidwood used a method that combined sign and lip reading and speaking. In other words, kind of an early version of what will later become known as the combined method. where you are using sign language, but also using sign language in order to teach someone how to also articulate English. Most rich Americans who had deaf children sent them to be educated in England. For the most part, this was likely because of the shared language, which made it more straightforward to teach and learn. But many also sent their children to England because they wanted their children to learn to communicate through speech, specifically to get this Braidwood method. In the late 18th century, Braidwood was advertising specifically on his school's ability to teach deaf children to speak. An ad in Scott's Magazine in 1767 promised to, quote, undertake to teach anyone of a tolerable genius in the space of about 3 years to speak and read distinctly. Of course, we're talking about speaking English. This was really attractive to potential clients, mostly wealthy parents who assumed, like most 18th and 19th century people, that deaf people were mentally deficient and incapable of learning. So it seemed quite revolutionary to them that this method could overcome that.
Francis Green, an American, sent his son Charles to Braidwood in the late 18th century and was thrilled with his son's progress in spoken English. After visiting with his son at Braidwood School, Francis Green wrote, quote, on my visit in September 1782, his improvements were very perceptible in speech, the construction of language, and in writing. He had made a good beginning in arithmetic and surprising progress in the arts of drawing and painting. I found him capable of not only comparing ideas and drawing inferences, but expressing his sentiments with judgment. On my desiring him to attempt something he thought himself unequal to, I set him the example by doing it myself, upon which he shook his head and with a smile replied clearly, you are a man, sir, I am a boy. Braidwood wrote to Francis Green again in 1782 about his plans for Charles's education, saying the boy was excelling in language, math, geography, geometry, science, and drawing. William Bowling, a wealthy Virginian, proudly described his son Thomas, another Braidwood pupil, as having, quote, the manners of the most polished gentleman, his articulation so perfect that his family and friends and servants understood him in conversation, end quote.
Students at Braidwood School did also use sign and finger spelling. Braidwood's goal was education over communication style. In other words, he was focused on the students' overall education more than the method that they used to communicate. Several of his students never used oral methods and only used sign, and this was not considered a problem or an impediment. Braidwood ultimately founded 2 schools, the first in Edinburgh and a second in London, which was funded by the king, which I think is kind of cool. And later, his grandson, John Braidwood, took Braidwood's methods to Virginia, where he opened a short-lived school, the Cobb's School. The Cobb School was the first school for the deaf in the United States, but it holds that honor, but it doesn't hold anything else because it only stayed open for about 1 year, opening in 1815 and closing permanently in 1816. So they might have been the first, but they were not open long enough for anyone to have been effectively educated there.
While most Americans sent their children to England to be educated by Braidwood, it was the French who were really the innovators when it came to deaf education in the 18th and 19th century. The innovation stemmed entirely from one man, a Catholic priest named Abbé Charles Michel de l'Épée. De l'Épée worked closely with the poor in Paris. Am I saying that right? Yeah. Okay. L'Épée worked closely with the poor in Paris. Sometime in the 1750s, L'Épée met 2 deaf sisters who spoke in sign language and became fascinated with this form of communication. He became involved in educating the 2 girls, but also began to learn sign language from them. To L'Épée, sign language held the key for a sort of universal language, something that might transcend national boundaries to create a global human culture. And this sort of is reminiscent of Esperanto and the sort of philosophical goals of that as well. This was inextricably intertwined with the French Enlightenment. L'Épée saw sign language used universally as rationalizing deaf people.
So, Let's get just a little theoretical and big brain for just a moment. The addition of deaf education to Enlightenment thinking was a natural fit. The 18th century Enlightenment philosophers, often now called the modernists, were focused on rationality, reality, and a shared objective truth. In other words, their argument was that there are realities in the world that are objectively, empirically true, and this truth must be acknowledged and shared. This is also, roughly speaking, the era of the scientific revolution, which required empirical methods to discover scientific truth. So you take careful measurements, you observe the natural world, you carefully design scientific experiments in order to learn the way the world around us works. The focus is on reproducibility, right? For instance, if a scientific study finds that the Earth is round, then the objective truth is that the Earth is round until that's disproven by science, right? You can't have an alternate reality about the shape of the Earth than I do, because my belief that the Earth is round is based on empirical evidence, right? It's a scientific reality that we're both bound by. Even if you don't believe that, that doesn't alter the shared reality. This is philosophy stuff, and I am no philosopher. And if there's an objective truth that we all must share, then it's critical that everyone in a community or a society is educated in that truth. And so a key aspect of the French Enlightenment during this period was focused on education. For instance, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a key Enlightenment thinker, is still considered an important figure in the history of education. I had to learn some of Rousseau's theories when I was in teachers' college, for instance. Education was necessary, the French Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau argued, because it helped to ensure that citizens, particularly men, right, they're the important citizens, would be capable of rationality, of self-governance, and of civilization. And we're putting civilization in quotes there. Within this system, people who may experience the world differently are then problematic. For instance, an autistic person who has a different way of seeing and understanding the world is, according to this worldview, refusing to be or incapable of being rational, right? They're refusing rationality, or they're unable to adhere to this shared rationality. A schizophrenic person who may see or hear things that others don't is, by this metric, irrational. And, important for our purposes in this episode, a deaf person who both does not have the shared sensory experience of the world and does not share a language with the people around them is also considered irrational, right, by this line of thinking. This is the era that Michel Foucault calls the Great Confinement, when asylums were built to confine and isolate those deemed irrational. So for deaf people, education was a means of rationalizing the irrational, in a sense. To quote scholars Jan Branson and Don Miller, education rationalized deaf people using, quote, the rational application of scientific techniques, and particularly through the transformation of their language from its natural vulgar form and content to an approximation of the universal tongue of knowledge and power. Of course, they're talking there about the natural vulgar form, meaning sort of like ad hoc sign or home sign, and the universal tongue being spoken language, shared language, like French or English.
So Lepay saw in sign language an opportunity to rationalize the irrational sign language developed and used on the streets of Paris. Don't get us wrong, Lepay is really important and celebrated in the history of deaf education. He wrote The Method of Educating the Deaf and Dumb, Confirmed by Long Experience, published in French in 1784 and translated to English in 1801, which revolutionized deaf education. This work influenced the French National Assembly to declare that deaf people had rights under the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and to provide federal funding to de Lepay's School for the Deaf. But at the same time, these were the philosophic underpinnings of the drive to develop and teach sign language in France. Moreover, they're the philosophic underpinnings that helped to create the schism in deaf education later in the 19th century. Anyway, back to our story. LePay became the first and more strenuous advocate for what became known as the manual method, which, as we mentioned before, means teaching deaf students to communicate with their hands using signed language. With the failure of the Cobb School, there was a very real need for a school for deaf students in the United States. In the 1810s, a man named Mason Fitch Cogswell decided to take steps to fill this need. Cogswell was a wealthy physician in Connecticut. His daughter Alice had lost her hearing when she got meningitis as a baby, and Cogswell was reluctant to send her abroad for an education. Convinced that others were in similar positions, Cogswell convinced the General Association of Congregational Ministers in Connecticut to fund a census of the deaf population of Connecticut, which counted about 84 deaf people in Connecticut in 1812. From this, Cogswell reasoned that there was probably 400 in all of New England. To Cogswell, this was a population that demanded a school.
Cogswell then turned to fundraising within his circles with the intention of using the money to send a teacher to Europe to learn from the educators of the deaf there and bring that training back to the United States. Ultimately, Cogswell raised enough cash to send Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, the son of his neighbors, to Europe. Gallaudet was educated at Yale and had just finished 2 years at the Andover Theological Seminary. But after graduating, he found himself in a bit of a slump. He'd been offered a couple of different calls to pastor, but he was unwell and declined them all. My theory is that he's just kind of depressed at this moment. He's just kind of, nothing is really speaking to him. Instead, Gallaudet just ends up staying at home with his parents a lot. Like he's kind of not doing anything. Now, during this downtime, he became sort of interested in Cogswell's attempts to teach his daughter Alice. According to the lore, and Gallaudet University actually refers to this as the legend, which I think is great, Gallaudet, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, looked out the window to see that his younger siblings were all outside playing, but they weren't interacting with this one little girl. That little girl turned out to be Alice Cogswell. Gallaudet went outside and he tried to communicate with her, and the two ended up experimenting with talking using fingerspelling. And fingerspelling is like, if you've ever seen The Miracle Worker about Helen Keller, or if you've ever watched anything about Helen Keller, then you're probably familiar with fingerspelling. It is literally using your finger to spell a letter or spell a word into the palm of someone's hand. It's the method that is used with Helen Keller later after this. While some versions of the story say that Gallaudet introduced fingerspelling sort of on accident to Alice and wasn't able to teach her much more because of his lack of understanding of this method, according to historian Rebecca Edwards, Alice was already learning fingerspelling and also English at a private school in Hartford, Connecticut. Like they had a teacher that had learned the method specifically to help teach Alice. So Gallaudet didn't necessarily stumble upon this amazing way to get through to her. She already knew this stuff. But either way, Cogswell saw Gallaudet's growing interest in communicating with Alice and chose him to go to Europe to learn the methods of deaf education.
Gallaudet first went to learn from the Braidwoods, likely because they were the best in the United States. But the Braidwood family was pretty protective of their methods and agreed to take on Gallaudet as an apprentice at their London school, where he would help to teach penmanship while also being instructed himself in oralist methods for a minimum of 3 years. But this wasn't what Gallaudet or Cogswell wanted. They wanted to learn and bring methods to the U.S. At the same time, a man named Abbé Roche-Ambroise Coucoron-Sicard, a French priest who happened to be one of Abbé Lapey's star students, was lecturing in London. Sicard was touring Europe giving demonstrations of the manual method with 2 of his students, including a young man named Laurent Clerc. Gallaudet attended the demonstrations, and after a brief excursion to meet with another teacher in Scotland named Dugald Stewart, who also used manual methods, became convinced that it was the manual method, not the Braidwoods mixed method that emphasized oralism, that needed to come back to the U.S.
There's a lot of really like nationalistic names there. Like this long French name and then Dugald Stuart. Gallaudet studied in France with Sicard until he ran out of money. Gallaudet wasn't ready to teach on his own yet, so he went to Laurent Clerc, Sicard's deaf student and teaching apprentice, to ask him to accompany him back to New England, making a pitch that they would then start a school when they returned in Connecticut. Now, this might seem like a huge request for Clerc, right? Like he would have to relocate to a foreign country where no one speaks either of his two languages, right? He speaks French Sign Language and French. And then once you get there, like, help me start this school from scratch, right? That's a lot. But Clerc leaped at the proposition. He was a young man. I think he was 29 or 30 at this moment. He was eager to forge out on his own, especially eager to establish himself as a teacher in his own right. And I sort of love this image. Gallaudet and Clerc were almost the same age. I see this as two young men full of a desire to change the world with these exciting teaching methods, right? They're kind of like on fire for education and the possibilities of education. I think that's really lovely. Sicard, though, was very sad to see Clerc go, writing, quote, "Clerc carries with him the regrets of his pupils and of the whole establishment. He was its glory and its honor, but everything yields to the good he will accomplish. In order to console myself for his departure, I love to think of him as the apostle of the deaf mutes in the New World," which I think is just an incredible thing to say. And it's very accurate to what Clerc goes on to do, kind of an apostle of deaf language. Gallaudet and Clerc returned to Connecticut, and after a brief tour trying to raise some cash, the partners founded the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut in 1817.
Clerc and the school he helped to found was always very progressive, even when Gallaudet had to work to catch up. The American School was unusual in that it had both hearing and deaf teachers for over its first 25 years, including Laurent Clerc, who was the first deaf teacher of the deaf in United States history. This was not a given in deaf education. At most of the schools in Europe, deaf people were students, but not teachers, because the assumption was that to learn, to communicate, deaf people needed to learn from hearing folks. But Clerc was insistent in his teaching in the American School that deaf people were equal to hearing people in all ways. Most people assumed that deaf people were inherently simple and unhappy. In other words, they believed that deaf people were lacking, that there was a baseline way to exist, which was hearing, and that to be deaf was to be missing or lacking something without hearing. But Clerc rejected this interpretation, writing, and trigger warning for the out-of-date language here, quote, "He who never had anything has never lost anything, and he who never lost anything has no loss to regret. Consequently, the deaf and dumb who have never spoken have never lost either hearing or speech, and therefore cannot lament either the one or the other. And he who has nothing to lament cannot be unhappy. Consequently, the deaf and dumb are not unhappy. Besides, it is a great consolation for them to be able to replace hearing by writing and speech by signs," end quote.
Just as an aside here, you'll know Averill just said like the trigger warning for the out-of-date language. Deaf and dumb, so like the term dumb, and also you'll sometimes hear deaf mute, were just very common run-of-the-mill terms for deaf people in this time period. The word dumb referred to their inability, according to people around them, to speak in English, right? To vocalize English. Clerc and Gallaudet worked well together, and the American School was immediately successful. However, in 1819, the two had a falling out when Clerc fell in love with and married a deaf former student of the American School, Eliza Boardman. Gallaudet's first reaction was to state that this was an inappropriate pairing because deaf people should not, according to him, and according to most general public belief, deaf people should not marry one another because it was likely to result in deaf children. This was a bad take, right? Like, to put a really a hard line under it. Bad take. Not only because Clerk and Boardman went on to have 6 hearing children, they didn't have any deaf children, but also because it's premised on the belief that ultimately it would be better if there were fewer deaf people in the world, and that deaf people should be avoided when possible, right? Deafness should be avoided when possible. It positioned hearing people as superior and argued against a deaf culture independent of hearing people. Clerk, understandably, was pretty pissed at Gallaudet's position, but the two did continue to work together at the American school. And as a side note here, just to complicate this even more, even Clerk had earlier in his life also believed that deaf people should not intermarry. This was like a very mainstreamed idea among most hearing people, that deaf people should not intermarry. And Clerk had also sort of adopted that belief because it was just in the water, right? Presumably, as his career in deaf cultural awareness developed, he changed his mind, right? But it really demonstrates just how pervasive those beliefs were, that even at one point Clerk believed that deaf people should not intermarry. But what's kind of remarkable here is that before long, Gallaudet came to realize that he was wrong, and their partnership was repaired. Their friendship was repaired. This was kind of a momentary thing. It was serious while it lasted, but it didn't last forever. In fact, Gallaudet himself married a deaf woman named Sophia Fowler in 1821. Like Clerk, Gallaudet had many children, all of whom were hearing. And also, like Clerk, the entire household communicated in sign language. So they both had bilingual households that communicated, for the most part, in sign language.
Gallaudet, Clerk, and their students at the American school helped to develop what we now know as American Sign Language, adapted from the French sign that Laurent Clerc learned from Abbé Sicard. Teaching the language was, of course, incredibly powerful, but almost as powerful was the example of Gallaudet, and especially Clerc, as people. As Sicard had predicted, Clerc became an apostle of sign language, spreading the language, but also spreading goodwill for the manual method. As Rebecca Edwards writes, quote, Clerc's role in brokering the acceptance of the manual method in the United States cannot be overestimated. He was a far more powerful public symbol than Gallaudet could have been. After all, Gallaudet was hearing, and so he would have to argue for the method's effectiveness in the abstract. Clerc could simply demonstrate it, end quote. When Clerc gave a public address, people were forced to admit the method's powerful effectiveness. Clerc was handsome, charismatic, and a persuasive speaker. John Vickery, Van Cleve, and Barry A. Crouch argue that Clerc was, quote, an exemplary model of what a deaf person could become: educated, industrious, socially skilled. Together, Gallaudet and Clerc helped to show American society that deaf people could have lives that exactly replicated those of hearing people, not just because of their work and education, but because of their personal lives as examples.
So the manual or sign method became the dominant way to educate the deaf in the United States. The New York School, sometimes also called Fanwood, was founded right after the American School and also adopted American Sign Language by 1833. Both schools eventually used a bilingual or a combined method, teaching ASL and also English, which allowed students to communicate with each other, but also with the rest of American society. In all of his writing and speaking, Gallaudet reinforced that deaf people were not lacking, but had been underserved. While many people tended to believe that deaf people were outsiders, separated from society by their lack of a shared language, Gallaudet framed it as the opposite. Deaf people needed to learn written English because hearing people lacked sign, right? It's not that deaf people lack English. It's that hearing people can't sign. As he wrote in 1811, quote, this, meaning learning written English, is necessary even for the purposes of their common intercourse with mankind, most of whom know nothing of the manner in which thoughts can be so easily expressed by signs and gestures, right? If they would just learn this easy language, then deaf people wouldn't have to learn English. Further, Gallaudet argued education in sign was a matter of justice for deaf Americans. The deaf people and their families had paid into public education systems in New England, but had themselves been ignored and isolated. Educating deaf people, Gallaudet wrote in 1818, was like the hand of justice rather than the hand of benevolence. Quote, which should extend to their thirsty souls the simple cup of refreshment which they so earnestly crave, end quote.
Due to the evangelism of Clerk and Gallaudet, sign became the gold standard of deaf education in the United States until the mid-19th century. But that started to change in the mid-century when two other men got involved in deaf education, Horace Mann and Samuel Gridley Howe. Horace Mann was an educational reformer. Again, someone who you often have to learn about if you're a teacher. Mann believed that education was critical to a healthy citizenry, not just in reading, writing, arithmetic, but in education and character and discipline. Mann began to believe that sign language was unsophisticated. Language was key to rationality, and an unsophisticated language meant unsophisticated people. He wrote in 1839, quote, an unscientific language will keep a people unscientific forever. So the knowledge of a people on any subject cannot far exceed the compass of the language which they fully comprehend. Language reacts upon the mind which uses it. Men are generally very willing to modify or change their opinions and views while they exist in thought merely, but when once formally expressed, the language chosen often becomes the mold of the opinion. The opinion fills the mold, but cannot break it and assume a new form. Thus errors of thought and of life originate in impotence of language. End quote. Almost as important, Mann believed that a shared language was essential to the creation of a society. In other words, deaf folks needed to learn English in order to assimilate. According to Mann, the power of uttering articulate sounds, of speaking as others speak, alone restores him, a deaf person, to society. Sign language, then, kept deaf people as a minority unable to communicate outside of other signers, separated from the rest of civil society.
Mann died in 1859 and never actually accomplished much in the way of reforming deaf education. It was Samuel Gridley Howe who took up the mantle and carried it forward. Howe was an abolitionist and a reformer. His wife, you may actually have heard of. If you haven't heard of Samuel Gridley Howe, you may have heard of his wife, Julia Ward Howe, who was also an abolitionist and is most famous for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I could sing it for you, but I won't. Howe and Mann were friends and professional partners in education reform. In 1832, Howe founded a school for the blind known as the Perkins Institution, or more commonly called the Perkins School. Howe began his work with the blind believing, not unlike Gallaudet's beliefs about deaf people, that blind people were just as capable of learning and no different from the rest of the population. But over time, Howe began to change his mind. As his graduates had trouble finding work, he began to believe that they were actually inferior to seeing people. So instead of interpreting that as evidence of an ableist society that doesn't want to hire blind people based on their prejudices, he saw that as an inherent failing of his blind students. Howe wrote in the Perkins School annual report, and he did write this in all caps, quote, "The blind, as a class, are inferior to other persons in mental power and ability."
In 1837, Howe took on a deaf-blind student named Laura Bridgman. Howe's work with Bridgman predated the more famous education of Helen Keller, but laid the groundwork for the pedagogical method that Anne Sullivan, a friend of Laura Bridgman, would later use with Keller. Mann and Howe saw Bridgman as a quote-unquote pedagogical experiment, an opportunity to test the possibilities of pedagogy. Bridgman was truly a blank slate, to use the theory of those Enlightenment philosophers, meaning that she was completely without knowledge and awareness. Thus, these education reformers could empirically test, according to their perspective, of course, the effectiveness of their pedagogy. Howe taught Bridgman language by putting raised letters on items like spoons, keys, etc., and she learned easily. But Howe didn't transition easily when Bridgman became a teenager. While she was little, he treated her essentially like a daughter. But in the 1840s, when Howe got married and started to have children, and as Bridgman became a teenager, the two really began to clash. Bridgman also joined the wrong kind of church and ruined his experiment. Howe didn't respond well to this and essentially abandoned her, leaving her without regular education, relying on whatever teachers the Perkins School could devote to her. As historian Ernest Freeberg described it, quote, "For a decade, Howe had been inspired by a vision of who Laura could become, and now this ideal was contradicted by who she actually was."
Yeah, it's we can't go into much more depth here on it, but I highly recommend it. Maybe we can do an episode on this someday on Howe and Bridgman. Bridgman was a fascinating character, and she really was a child who had been repeatedly abandoned. And so she really attaches to Howe, and Howe is the most important person in her life. She sees him all day, every day. She spends with him, right? And then when he gets married, he effectively just abandons her. His wife, Julia Ward Howe, did not get along with Bridgman, didn't like her, didn't want her around. And so, she writes these really sad letters like, "I don't understand. What did I do wrong? Why are you not spending time with me?" And her education really suffers because of that abandonment. So it doesn't speak well to Howe's character. Howe's disillusionment with blind education affected the way that Howe thought about people with other sensory disabilities, including deaf people. Specialized education in places like the Perkins School for the Blind or the American School for the Deaf, he thought, created clans out of blind or deaf people, separated from the rest of civil society by their own mysterious languages. Such clannishness needed to be prevented and stopped. Howe took this belief with him into his later work and reform. In the 1860s, Howe became the chair of the Massachusetts Board of State Charities, which gave him the power to shape the future of blind and deaf education. In 1867, the Massachusetts legislature convened a series of hearings to listen to suggestions about a possible school in the state for the deaf. Howe played a central role, invoking his friend Mann's educational theories and firmly arguing for the necessity of an oralist method. Howe testified that, quote, "The whole object of their education is to counteract the effects growing out of their condition. How do we do this? By subjecting them to the ordinary social influences so that they shall escape the effects of their condition. And we hold that undue congregation of these persons involves the unfavorable effects growing out of their infirmity." So by letting deaf people or blind people congregate together, you're encouraging them to communicate in ways that are not accessible to the rest of society. And it's essentially doubling down on what he sees as a disability. Sign was a particular threat to this process. Another educator who worked with Howe, Gardner Green Hubbard, testified that, quote, "As a general rule, wherever articulation is taught, the use of signs or of the manual alphabet should be entirely discarded."
The goal of deaf education, according to Howe and his supporters, was less to educate the deaf than to render the deaf more like the hearing. As historian Rebecca Edwards put it, quote, "It was to be the point of deaf education to make them more like us," end quote. Sign language was a marker of difference and encouraged deaf people to build their own communities and cultures separate from the hearing world. Speech was critical to breaking this process. In his second annual report to the State Board of Charities, Howe explained that, quote, "By teaching a mute to articulate, we bring him to closer association with us by using our vernacular in our way than by teaching him the finger language, which can never become our vernacular," end quote. Howe saw this as an act of benevolence, a generous intervention intended to save deaf people. Oralism was also framed as the best option for those who saw themselves as elite. Hubbard believed that only, quote, "a child of a little more than ordinary capacity," end quote, could be educated to speak. Hubbard testified to the Massachusetts legislature, quote, "If the child were of poor parents, I should not attempt articulation." When a legislator asked if he would let the child grow up in ignorance, Hubbard responded, "No, sir, I would send it to Hartford," meaning he would send it to the American school to receive a manual education.
During these hearings, Howe and his supporters also criticized Gallaudet and Clerc's system as training children for a life that they could never really be part of. Deaf children should be trained to labor because, as Howe put it, quote, they come mostly from a class of people who are accustomed to labor. They are going back to a class of people who are accustomed to labor. So some pretty classist there. Children from the American school, quote, can read and write and cipher, Howe said, but they have not been trained to do ordinary work as they ought to have been. In 1867, Massachusetts made their decision. The Clark School for the Deaf was founded in Northampton on the principles of oralism. After the 1860s, not only was oralism the dominant pedagogical approach to deaf education, the very way that Americans understood deaf people changed. No longer were they people that required a different pedagogical approach. But now, deafness itself was a disability that rendered people isolated and separated from the rest of society. As historian Douglas Bainton put it, quote, during the early and middle decades of the 19th century, sign language was a widely used and respected language among educators at schools for the deaf. By the end of the century, it was widely condemned and banished from many classrooms. In short, sign language was compatible with the former construction of deafness, but not with the latter.
By the close of the 19th century, sign language was described as un-American. What Howe had described as the clannishness of signing deaf people, oralists had started to describe as foreignness. In a society increasingly worried about immigration in the late 19th century, oralists saw deaf people as yet another group of cultural and linguistic foreigners who must, like immigrants or even like Native Americans, as we referenced in the episode about vocalize, be assimilated. They must all be assimilated. Just like Polish, Italian, or German, sign language was a foreign language that had no place in American society. To quote from Banton again, quote, educators worried that if deaf people are to exercise intelligently the rights of citizenship, then they must be made people of our language. They insisted that, quote, the English language must be made the vernacular of the deaf if they are not to become a class unto themselves, foreigners among their own countrymen. Learning English alongside sign was not sufficient. Sign language is an evil, wrote an oralist teacher from Pennsylvania in 1892. English is a jealous mistress. She brooks no rival. She was born to conquer and to spread all over the world. She has no equal. End quote.
It seems like a fairly natural, if gross, next step that oralists turned to eugenics to bolster their position. The kingpin of this turn was Alexander Graham Bell. And yes, that Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. Both Bell's mother and his wife were deaf, and he spent a significant amount of his working life working on various technologies to aid deaf and hard of hearing people. In his 20s, Bell taught an oralist educational system his father had developed called the Visible Speech System, which was intended to visually illustrate to deaf people how to move their mouth, tongue, and throat muscles to produce sounds in order to speak. Bell was a huge proponent of eugenics in the late 19th century. Eugenics promised that deafness could be, through careful control of intermarriage, eliminated. Sign language fostered the opposite. It encouraged a separate deaf culture, impermeable by those who did not speak sign, which would perpetuate deafness. In 1884, Bell wrote a paper published by the National Academy of Sciences in which he warned that this culture, which he referred to in true eugenic style as a quote-unquote deaf race, was already underway. That deaf clubs, associations, and specialized publications showed that deaf people understood themselves as a separate culture. There had even been rumblings of deaf intentional communities. Bell pointed out a suggestion from Laurent Clerc that the land owned by the American school be set aside for the creation of a deaf settlement.
And in this environment, oralists could style themselves as reform or aid workers in the same way that those who worked in Indian schools or resettlement houses did. They were doing a service by helping to assimilate the deaf into American culture. Deaf people were inherently peculiar by their difference, and sign only exacerbated that. Suffragist and philanthropist Mary Garrett stated at the Congress of Women at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair that learning to speak could ameliorate that peculiarity. It was, quote, solely the result of shutting up deaf children to be educated in sign schools, whence they emerge aliens in their own country, end quote. Sign education, she argued, was, quote, a cruel system of training the deaf differently from the hearing, end quote. With spoken English, the differences between deaf and hearing could be rendered irrelevant and invisible.
Further, eugenic oralists cast sign language as evidence of a primitive, savage nature. The late 19th century was the heyday of social Darwinism, an obsessive ranking of global peoples on an evolutionary ladder, with white people, of course, always on the top rung. Fully evolved people, quote unquote evolved people who were civilized and ready to be the world's leaders, were not only culturally cohesive, but conducted themselves like civilized people. Spoken language, many eugenic oralists argued, was what separated humans from animals. While manualists had argued that sign was a kind of original language, one that humans tended towards naturally, and thus one that was by its nature endowed by God, eugenic oralists interpreted sign as a form of communication low on the evolutionary ladder. Numerous scholars, including Charles Darwin, understood sign language as used by, quote, savages and deaf mutes. And that's a quote from Darwin. Gardner Hubbard, that man who had testified with Samuel Gridley Howe in Massachusetts for the establishment of an oralist school and who then became the president of the Clark School, later wrote that sign language, quote, resembles the languages of the North American Indian and the Hottentot of South Africa. It was unacceptable that white deaf people in the United States appear on the same evolutionary level as Africans and Indians.
Soon, oralism became the only option for the majority of deaf Americans. In the early 20th century, some states, such as Nebraska, passed laws that mandated oralist-only methods in their schools for the deaf, and prominent schools, such as the Virginia School for the Deaf and the New Jersey School for the Deaf, switched their curriculum to oralist only. The consensus around oralism eventually even got to the Gallaudet family. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet's son, Edward Minor Gallaudet, had followed his father into deaf education, but betrayed many of his father's core beliefs. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet passed away in 1851 when Edward was just a teenager. Eventually, Edward decided to continue his father's work in deaf education and in 1857 moved to Washington, D.C. to help establish a new school for the deaf called the Columbia Institution. In 1864, Gallaudet got authorization from Congress and Abraham Lincoln to confer college degrees at the Columbia Institution, establishing the first college for the deaf, now renamed Gallaudet University. Edward served as president of the college for 46 years. While he expressed dismay at the death of sign language, Edward agreed that deaf people were at risk of becoming a separate culture or race, criticizing deaf intermarriage and deaf cultural associations and clubs. While he continued to believe in the usefulness of sign, he conceded to the oralists that sign was a necessary evil to be used only as a tool to move deaf students towards spoken English. With even Gallaudet and his college embracing the oralist imperative, the oralist method became the dominant method of deaf education across the United States.
To be clear, many deaf people pushed back on this. The New York School, or Fanwood, continued to teach the manual method, and students from that school tended to be more insistent on the creation and the continuation of deaf culture. For instance, Thomas Fox, a deaf man from New York City, found his time at the Fanwood School revolutionary. Fox attended college at Gallaudet, but then returned to the New York School, where he eventually became the principal and editor of the school's publication, the New York Journal of the Deaf. Throughout his career, Fox advocated for deaf culture and civil rights. During his tenure as an educator, there was a tremendous push to remove deaf people, particularly deaf men, from the ranks of teachers of the deaf. For example, the Clark School, that center of oralism in Massachusetts, ran a teacher education program that only admitted hearing women, arguing that women, because of their nurturing nature, were better teachers, and that only hearing people were capable of enforcing an oralist educational environment, right? That by having hearing people, you would completely sort of get rid of any manualism that might even take place on an ad hoc basis. As a deaf man and a deaf male teacher, Fox defied this trend and used his position to advocate for deaf culture. He helped to petition for New York State to transfer deaf schools from the State Department of Welfare and Charity to the Department of Education, and fiercely defended sign language. Removing sign language entirely from deaf schools, he argued, was cruel. Quote, to the occasional cry for a speech atmosphere in schools, employing a combined system. The Fanwood School had that combined system, right? We would modestly but emphatically suggest that the suppression of sign language in the playrooms and playgrounds of deaf children is a measure of cruelty, opposed to their instincts, inimical to their happiness, and detrimental to their moral and intellectual development.
Deaf people use their publications and political advocacy to push back on the move toward oralist-only schools. George Vaditz wrote about the Nebraska law in a deaf publication, calling it the Nebraska iniquity, in which he argued that deaf children would be reduced to, quote, blinking automata, wondering why they exist and not fitting in anywhere, end quote. Even more telling was just how difficult it was to effectively crush sign language, even at oralist schools. Even in Nebraska, children continued to pick up sign language from one another and continued to use it, causing teachers and administrators to work tirelessly to try and stop it and enforce speech. The superintendent of the Nebraska school wrote that, quote, despite these efforts, the pupils insistently use signs in communicating with each other, a condition which is in every combined school in the world and which deprives the people of the use of speech outside the schoolroom, end quote. When the superintendent of a New Jersey school began to get rid of manual classes, students held a protest and successfully appealed to the State Board of Education.
By the 1930s, oralist-only schools and programs did start to decline, though slowly, mostly due to that kind of deaf activism. In Georgia in 1939, deaf people advocated for the removal of the state's oralist superintendent, and then replaced him with a graduate of Gallaudet who promised to support a combined method. This change was powerful, but it didn't necessarily mean the end of a battle for deaf culture or deaf civil rights. The mid-century marked a renewed enthusiasm for technologies to quote-unquote help people to hear, which ultimately reinforced speech as the preferred mode of communication, right? There's a little bit of a controversy right now, for instance, over cochlear implants, right? Like, when is it appropriate to get a cochlear implant? How useful are they? And a lot of deaf people have mixed feelings about them. But deaf people continued to advocate for deaf spaces and for the importance of deaf culture, especially influenced in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by other civil rights movements, such as the Civil Rights Movement and the Disability Rights Movement. I, for instance, would love to come back to this and do an episode on the 1988 Deaf President Now protests at Gallaudet, which demanded that the University for the Deaf have deaf leadership, right? So it's an ongoing thing, and this certainly this tension between oralism and manualism doesn't just sort of disappear in the 1930s, but things adapt and change, and these tensions continue to exist, just in different modes.
We just need more histories of disabilities, history of deafness.
I would love to do an episode on Deaf President Now. I agree. It's funny that, you know, having a historian of disability on the podcast, I have not actually done very many episodes at all about disability.
Yeah, I agree.
Which
Whereas,
is a shame.
As a historian of sex, I just do episodes on sex all the time.
Right.
We need to do better.
I promise to be better. Yes.
Okay.
Many more episodes to come. This is an untapped, important history.
Yes, I agree. So with that said, thank you all for joining us today. As always, we invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at dig_history, or you can join us on Facebook in our Facebook group, Dig History Pod Squad, where we shall, share memes and hold each other's hands through these trying times. If you have a comment or a question or want to share some kind words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org, because we do love listener mail. If you're an educator, we've got all kinds of episodes you can use in the classroom, like this one, and free teaching resources, including full lesson plans, on our website, digpodcast.org. And we realize that recent changes to curriculum in states like Florida and Texas will complicate being able to use our episodes in the classroom. So just please reach out to us if there's anything we can do to be helpful to you in your classroom. We want to let you know that we have a book forthcoming October 15th, 2024. You can pre-order that now. Woohoo! On the Cornell website that's linked to on our website, digpodcast.org. And we're doing all kinds of really cool events this fall, including a virtual talk with the New York State Library. If you happen to be in Western New York, we have a launch weekend. We're doing events at with the Buffalo University of Buffalo Gender Institute at the Fitz and Books bookstore in Buffalo, as well as
Fitz Books and Waffles.
Fitz Books and Waffles in Buffalo, as well as the Susan B. Anthony Museum in Rochester. So hopefully we can see you there, and if not, we have those virtual events at New York State Library, but also a book club that you can sign up for. All you got to do is either pre-order the book or help us build a donation bundle to send off to an abortion fund and support for kids with trans rights stuff, or trans kids. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you'll
exciting stuff. We hope that you'll join us at those. Please.
Absolutely. We'd love to see your faces and know that we're not just talking to the ether. The numbers obviously in what our stats tell us that we're not just talking into the ether, but it's always exciting to meet the faces behind the numbers.
Absolutely.
And finally, you'll find full bibliographies, the scripts for all of our episodes, resources, and a link to our swag store at digpodcast.org. And that's it. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye. An obsessive ranking of global peepers.
Deaf people were often.
Sorry for making you say Connecticut like 17 times there.
George Veditz wrote about the Nebraska law in a deaf.
The Clark School for the Deaf was founded in Northampton on the principles